Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the second episode in my series of conversations with the political theorist Paul Sagar about what's wrong with political philosophy and how the history of ideas might help. Today, we're talking about a thinker from the 18th century, Adam Smith, who's not usually associated with deep reflections on politics. He's thought of as an economist. He's given his name to an economic think tank, the Adam Smith Institute. We're going to be discussing why that is an absolute travesty and how Adam Smith can really get us thinking right about politics. Paul, we're going to be talking about someone, Adam Smith, whose name I'm sure is quite well known. A lot of people will recognize the name, but they might think it's a bit odd in a series thinking about how better to think about the questions of political philosophy to bring in Adam Smith, because I think for most people, he would be thought of as an economist rather than a political philosopher. So that's the first thing to address. And then secondly, I think most people would say, well, if he had a view, Adam Smith, if there is an Adam Smithian view about how to organize a society, it's basically free markets. And so he's one of those economists who think that politics should butt out and let the market get on with it. Now, both those views are wrong. The conventional views of Smith are wrong. So we should probably start by having you say who Adam Smith really was, if he wasn't just a caricatured free market economist.
The first thing to say, I suppose, is that economics didn't exist when Adam Smith first started working. He was employed as a professor of moral philosophy most of his life at the University of Glasgow, and he would have spent most of his time teaching students bits of philosophy, but also, interestingly, lots of history. And yes, he then went on near the end of his life to publish the book The Wealth of Nations, which is the famous book that many people claim to have read and quote from, but very few people have actually read, because if they did read it, they'd realize that although it has lots to say about markets and it has lots to say about how economic relations might occur between people and nations, it's much more historically structured, sociologically structured, and much more a piece of international theorizing about how competition unfolds between nations over time than anything that looks like economics today. A main reason for that being there's no mathematics in it. It's not mathematical. He has lots of interesting things to say about markets, but he's not an economist in anything like the modern sense. Which doesn't mean he hasn't got an important place in the origin of economics as a modern academic discipline. He certainly does. His ideas are tremendously influential. But he himself certainly didn't set out to invent economics. His famous book isn't really a work of economics in the modern sense. And during his lifetime, what he was really famous for was his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was an extremely sophisticated contribution to a version of ethical theory which took its lead from David Hume, the other great Scottish Enlightenment political philosopher. So Smith himself is a tremendously interesting intellectual character who it's just not right to describe as an economist. He's influential in the formation of what we now call economics, but he is not in any meaningful sense an economist as we understand that term. Which moves us to the second point. Yeah, most of the time when people who don't really know anything about Adam Smith nonetheless know the name, they nonetheless think free markets. And they don't just think free markets, they think an aggressive form of, often associated with Margaret Thatcher, the Reagan Revolution, people like Milton Friedman in Chicago, who are pushing this line that it's caricatured as the greed is good framework in the Hollywood movie, but it's the idea that, hey, the state just needs to get out of the way. We need to not only liberalize markets, but we need to liberalize markets because Adam Smith told us this. And there is a fascinating story about how Smith's name gets completely reappropriated around the 60s, 70s, and 80s as a kind of legitimation technique for moving towards the Thatcher-Reagan reconfigurations of our economy.
Those two books, Theory of Moral Sentiments, 1759, The Wealth of Nations, a little under 2 decades later, 1776, his two great works, gave rise to a thing that German scholars called, and then it got appropriated into English, Das Adam Smith Problem, a very portentous term, for what seemed to be the puzzle here, which was, how can this one guy have written these two books? Because in the caricature version, they seem to be pulling in very different directions. On the one hand, the later book, Wealth of Nations, looks like it's advocating for self-interest, and sometimes that gets turned into selfishness. Things will go better if individuals just do what they think is right for them after the main chance. You go out, be greedy, try and accumulate. Society will benefit. So it looks like, to some people, this cliched version, as you said, that greed is good. And then moral sentiments is about sympathy and virtue and the importance of fellow feeling, the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes. It feels like it comes from a completely different mindset. So for slightly rigid Germans of a few generations ago, the thought was, is this two people? Did he change his mind? How could one person think these two things? I think the general view now is it's a bit of a non-problem, but just explain the relationship between the two books, because if it's on the one hand sympathy and on the other hand selfishness, it does sound like there are odds, but it isn't that, is it?
That's right. It's funny, we have to call it Das Adam Smith problem because it comes from Germans, although we could just call it the Adam Smith problem. But as you said, it's basically, in its crudest manifestation, it says one book is about self-interest and maybe selfishness. The other book is about benevolence. But how could the same author write two books? One that says self-interest is great because it leads to the wealth of nations, and the other that says benevolence is great because that leads to morality. Surely there's a contradiction. And for several generations now, scholarship in this area has said, no, that's a non-problem. The first book is really about sympathy, which is a technical understanding of our ability to share each other's sentiments through acts of imagination and not simply be selfish, as some people in a certain reading, Thomas Hobbes or especially Bernard Mandeville earlier in the 18th century said, look, human beings are incapable of what we would now call empathy, what Smith called sympathy, and therefore all morality is a kind of fraud. And Smith, following Hume, says, no, we have this capacity to genuinely care about other people because we can share in their emotions and imagine what we would feel if we were them. And from that, you can construct potentially all of human morality understood as an outplay of this basic aspect of our psychology. And the other book, The Wealth of Nations, isn't advocating selfishness. It's saying, well, look, let's just zoom out from the sympathy stuff and say, if we just look at the way humans interact in markets and also in politics and think, if we think, look, what they're really trying to do here is look after themselves, not that they are trying to screw everybody else over or that they only care about themselves, but insofar as they're motivated by incentives organized around their self-interest, how will that play out in large-scale social systems? And these are not incompatible because you can zoom out and look at the large-scale social system and think, if we look at how incentives work and how markets operate, we can expect this kind of outcome. But if we flip back to looking at individuals and remembering that they're capable of sympathy, we can still see that they're completely capable of morality. So that's more or less, I think, the solution that everybody has to the crude version of Das Adam Smith problem. But the interesting question is, does the solution potentially miss something that was imperfectly, but nonetheless genuinely being expressed by the Das Adam Smith problem? And I like to think of that as the challenge that there's something problematic about thinking that morality can take place without being compromised in market-driven societies. And that's something that we're still very familiar with today. The idea that if we allow lots of self-interested behavior in markets, because potentially that generates lots of wealth for everybody collectively, does that not have worrying implications for the way we treat each other, the things that we value? Is it not seriously problematic to think that if you take the brakes off markets, you may not be sacrificing something important in the way that we interact with each other as moral agents? So it's not, oh, look, Adam Smith, how could he write benevolence on the one hand and selfishness on the other? That's a contradiction. That's too crude. But the idea that there may be something worryingly morally problematic about what we today tend to call capitalism, that's a long-running anxiety in the Western tradition since long before Adam Smith. And then I think that Das Adam Smith problem was playing around with, although it was not particularly helpfully expressed in the idea of there being a contradiction between the two books.
And was that an anxiety that Adam Smith himself had? I mean, I'm assuming in many ways it was, given he wrote these two books and he had deeply thought about the relationship between these two different modes of human and social understanding. As you say, it's a long-running tradition. I think the way to get into that is to try and make sense of the term that Smith used. So Smith didn't talk about capitalism because capitalism as an ism is a 19th century invention, so he couldn't have done. The word capitalist existed in the 18th century, but not capitalism. He wasn't a free marketeer in the sense those two terms are conjoined. He was, as we will discuss, very interested in freedom, very interested in markets, but he didn't think there was this slogan which was just the free market is the solution. The term that he used to describe societies organized around exchange was commercial society, which is a slightly distancing term for us. It sounds a little archaic in some ways. What did he mean by it, and why, and you've written about this, and I really want to focus on this, why does it not really make sense to think of Smith as an advocate of commercial society? So it's not like Smith, again, in the cliched version, might be thought to be someone who says commercial society good, alternatives bad. What did he mean by commercial society, and how did it underpin the other questions we might ask about social organization?
It's really important, I think, to focus on this because for Smith, commercial society is a technical term. Sometimes it's not helpful in much of the modern scholarship or the modern appropriation of Smith for political ends, because when he says commercial society, people tend to think, oh, he must mean capitalism, right? He must mean some rough idea of lots of markets and the government protecting property holders, and that must be what he means by commercial society. And in fact, he means something very precise. Although he doesn't actually use the term very often in his own works, when he does use it, he means societies where people live from exchange. And you might be thinking, well, isn't that just normal? Well, Smith thinks, well, no, it wasn't normal for much of human history. You can sort of think, well, if you go right back to sort of almost prehistoric times, humans lived by hunting and gathering. He would have called them hunters. We call them hunter-gatherers. But you killed and grew what you ate, and most people in your very small community, maybe only 100 or so people, had to be involved in the killing or the growing, or you didn't eat. Then, later, humans developed a different kind of society, which Smith called shepherding, which is a bit misleading because it sounds like Bo Peep looking after lambs, but he means more like warlord Khanates rampaging from out of Mongolia and killing lots of people. But they survive partly by plundering, but largely by having enormous flocks, which they live off. And they survive not through hunting and gathering directly, but through pastoral society, large-scale flock societies. And then later he thinks, well, you're likely to get progress towards more like settled agriculture, people settling down and having large-scale farming, but still most people are going to eat what they grow, but rather than it being small-scale societies, it's bigger. So it's more developed than the sort of prehistoric stage. But he thinks that, later on, you're going to move to a system where people exchange. So rather than having to grow the potatoes that I eat, some people grow the potatoes, they grow more than they can eat, and they trade those potatoes to other people who've grown the shovels that they gave them to help them grow more potatoes in the first place. So now you've got people living from exchange. They have to make shovels using iron forging or whatever it is. I don't know how you make shovels, however they make shovels, but they can't eat shovels, so they have to exchange the shovels for potatoes. Right? And of course, that's a simplified caricature, but then you can see how that scales up. And once you have some people who are specialized in growing crops or raising certain kinds of animals for meat, they only need to eat a tiny proportion of what they grow and raise, and they trade the rest. And then everybody else who's not living from growing and raising their food themselves, they can start making lots of other things. So commercial societies are societies in which people live predominantly from exchange. The way you survive is not by going and growing potatoes yourself, it's by lecturing at university like I do, or making podcasts like you do, getting paid for it, and then buying your food, right? So advanced societies are commercial societies, and that's what all advanced civilizations ultimately have to be, because you need a lot of people to be able to go and do lots of work that isn't making food in order to have high-level civilizational achievements like universities and industries and armies and all these kinds of things. So that's what commercial society is for Smith.
So I've got two questions coming out of that. One is you use the word progress and you use the word advance, which sound value-laden in this context and also somewhat teleological, as though human history is sort of geared towards this and there are lower and higher stages, and maybe even within commercial society it's sort of progressed towards more and more sophisticated forms of exchange. Is that how he saw it? Because the other way you could think about what you just described is it more or less covers everything. I mean, once you've got beyond Genghis Khan, and I like the thought of Genghis Khan as pastoral, that's, for most of us, those two things pull in different directions, but not in the way you described it. But once you get beyond much earlier forms of human organization, certainly seen in the history of the last 1,000 years, everything is exchange. This isn't just capitalism. Almost all the ways in which you might organize a society of a scale that includes towns and cities and includes people working on the land and people working in industry, almost everything from capitalism to communism, frankly, as it's manifested in real world settings, not maybe as it is in pure Marxist theory, is commercial society. So is it teleological, but also does it specify, or is it just the background condition of all of modern life?
So I think that is exactly right, that for Smith, the background condition of all, not just modern actually, but a great deal of ancient life is commercial society. If you want a large scale society in which lots of things are happening, there's division of labor, there's exchange, there's luxury products, there's higher learning, there's all these complex things that you only find in civilizations, they have to be commercial societies. So ancient Rome, commercial society. Ancient Athens, commercial society. I think he also thinks that although it's messed up and not operating like it should be, the China of his day, the largest country in the world at that point with the biggest population, was still a commercial society because most people may have had to eat their own rice, but in the cultural leading powerhouse of Beijing and places like that, they weren't growing their own rice. They were bringing it in from the provinces. So that's a kind of commercial society. And so it's not just the modern world, it's the ancient world as well. It's any kind of advanced sort of civilization will be a commercial society. Is it teleological? I'm not sure I'd want to use that word because that implies that it's kind of set in stone that this is how human societies have to end up. Smith is quite alert to the fact that things can go catastrophically wrong, and he thinks that human civilization was stuck in the trap of people like Genghis Khan riding out, destroying the commercial society, stealing all their gold, enslaving all their men, and doing awful things to their women, and that kept messing up the development of commercial societies. So it's not necessary that humans always are going to end up with enough time ending up with commercial societies. Things can go wrong as well as go right. But insofar as they are any kind of advanced civilization, they will have to be a commercial society because most people can't be growing and rearing their own food if you're going to have a large scale culture. So yes, that would mean that on Smith's understanding of commercial society, what we would now call communist societies, of course, he had no knowledge of this because this was all after he died. Marx writes later, and then, of course, modern instantiations of communism come later in the real world. But I think if you use Smith's understanding of commercial society, the Soviet Union was a kind of commercial society. Most people in the Soviet Union did not grow their own food. They worked in factories. They were given wages that were controlled by the government, and they had to exchange for survival. So they were living from exchange. The difference was the market was massively restricted under the Soviet regime to terrible inefficiencies just in the levels of resources, let alone the levels of political repression that had to be put on top of subjugating the market to the demands of the state, which led to catastrophic humanitarian disasters. But from Smith's point of view, it would have still been a kind of commercial society, just an incredibly inefficient, politically oppressive, badly run one, that there's all kinds of reasons not to want to end up in that kind of society. But like you say, yeah, for Smith, it's kind of commercial society is the background condition of any advanced form of society that humans will find themselves living in, which again means it's not interchangeable with our understanding of capitalism. Because capitalism, for us, to put it in Smith's terms, would be a particular species of commercial society. It's one way to operate a commercial society, the one that we in the West are particularly familiar with, and has so far proved by far and away the least worst, I think is the best way to put it, of the available ways of trying to rig this kind of thing up. But it's not that all commercial societies are capitalist. In fact, capitalism is just one version of commercial society, if you want to apply the Smith framework to the world that we now live in.
So that suggests it is one of the ways in which how Smith is used, the Adam Smith Institute and in other places, to be Smith equals commercial society equals capitalism equals good, let's have more Smith and we'll get more of the good stuff. And you've written, I like this analogy, you've written that to be in favor of commercial society in Smith's terms is a bit like a fish being in favor of water, like a fish saying, as a fish philosopher, as a fish political philosopher, I'm pro-water and I'm anti-water. It doesn't mean anything. The really interesting question, it's a philosophical question, but it's also a historical question, a psychological question. The way we talked about last time, political philosophy then feeds into these other ways of thinking. The important question for the fish is it good water? Is it clean water? Is it dirty water? How is the water that comes to me being treated by other people who might interfere with it? What are the frameworks that Smith thinks we should use to answer that question? So if the question is not for or against commercial society is a background fact. If you want to, you can try and recreate pastoral conditions. Good luck to you, but it's going to be very tricky if you're living in London or Paris or, frankly, almost anywhere in the 18th century, in Edinburgh, in Glasgow, and also in the countryside, right? Because even if you're growing the food, you'll actually find that exchange is the basis by which you're able to survive. So given it's the background fact, how do we then organize our ways of thinking in order to decide which is the good or bad version of it? It's not going to be pro or anti. It's going to have to be more subtle than that. What are the tools that we need to make sense of it for Smith?
Smith would have said, and this is at the heart of the wealth of nations, let's get a sense of what the bad water looks like, the kind that you don't want to be swimming in. You might have to swim in water if you're a fish, if you've got to live in some kind of commercial society, if you want to live in advanced civilization. But here's an example of a bad one, the world that he was living in right then, which he thought was constituted by the merchant elite classes, what we would now call the fat cats, the capitalists, having politicians in their back pocket and rigging everything up so that it benefited the rich elites at the expense of ordinary people. He called that the mercantile system, which we sometimes think of now as the nation simply trying to get more gold, which was part of mercantilism as traditionally understood. Instead of having open markets, you have monopolies and tariffs, to bring in some modern references, and try and build up your domestic gold reserves to screw over every other nation. And he thought, well, that's a terrible economic policy. It actually makes everybody worse off, except the merchants who own the monopolies. So one thing he wanted to say is, don't just work in abstract theory. Let's think about how these things play. And one thing he wanted to say was, and right now, the way we're rigging up our commercial society here in Britain, and indeed in Europe, but generally in the 18th century, is a terrible way. We are polluting our own water, to use that metaphor. He wanted to say, well, one way we can improve that is by having more liberalised markets, taking away the protection of the fat cats and saying, no, you've got to compete. And so they have to stop selling shoddy goods at inflated prices to ordinary people, and then ordinary people would benefit. So it's not a complete myth that Smith was in favour of more liberalised markets, but the reason he was in favour of that was because his world was one characterised by massive inequality, which benefited the people who held the purse strings and the levers of industry. But to go back to your question of, okay, so what do you do? Well, Smith thinks, well, one thing you want to do if you're going to do good political philosophy and understand how to make these things better is look at things like the historical situation in which different forms of regime find themselves and think about why is it that certain conditions have come to pass and certain people have ended up with the levers of power. And so you need to pay much more attention to history and the actual real history of where your society's come from than simply thinking, okay, let's go back to first principles and design a just society, in our minds, as Plato famously did in the Republic. Smith thinks that's just pointless. That is not going to help you understand how to make the water cleaner around here.
So I want to ask you about both the history there and also the question of equality. Maybe we should do equality and inequality first. So on the one hand, as you've said, there is some truth to the idea that Smith, relative to the situation he found himself in, wanted to liberalize markets. But what about the other way? So were there limits or boundaries to the extent to which he thought the people who were worst off? So we talked last time about John Rawls, a much later thinker, but the basis of his idea of justice is one of the fundamental questions you have to think about is what kind of society would be best for the worst off? Usually that's held up in contrast to a free market approach. Did Smith have a view about the limits of inequality? So there's a form of inequality he didn't like, which is protectionism, capture, essentially certain groups of people capturing power and wealth, political influence and markets. That's fatal. Did he have a view about where you set, as it were, the limits the other way? Is there a kind of poverty or misery or level of disadvantage that should be the focus of how you organize the water in your society?
So this is where it gets complicated, not because Smith is at fault for being complicated, but because the world is complicated. So to approach this from one angle, and then I'll try and pivot to the other angles in turn. The first one would be, Smith is quite aware that if you liberalize markets, you are going to have more inequality in your society, right? Because some people are going to win from market exchanges and they're going to get better off. And lots of people are not going to have access to being the fat cats, to being what we would now think of as the capitalists, the people who make the most money from owning privately the means of production. And Smith thinks that is something to be concerned about because it's not good if some human beings' lives are going much worse than other people just because they were unlucky enough to be born poor and denied the access to the higher echelons of society which allow people to become rich, because let's not mess around. The rich pass on their advantages to their children and they tend to monopolize these things. And markets will tend to punish people who are already poor. And Smith was very attuned to this and he did think it was a problem. But he thought, on balance, I am simplifying a little bit here, but it'll do for now, that if this was the price worth paying, because if you liberalized markets and moved away from the fat cats monopolizing and using the power of the state to protect themselves system, then you would increase the level of what we would now think of as GDP. You would make society as a whole richer, and thus the rising tide would lift all boats. Liberalized commercial societies would have more inequality than potentially even the kind of mercantile system he disliked, but that would be a price worth paying because the people who were still poor and more unequal in a liberalized commercial society would be dramatically better off than if we didn't liberalize, and are dramatically better off than in poorer societies where markets are not allowed to operate. So inequality becomes tolerated on the Smith view because even though some people still have less, they are richer than they would be if we hadn't have the markets improve overall. So it's a kind of trade, he thinks, which again, why he's not happily caricatured as the guy who just thinks markets are great because they just lead to wealth. He thinks, look, they're acceptable because they lead to wealth, but they come with a real moral cost, which is many people are going to be much poorer in this society, but they're going to be better off than they would be if we didn't have any inequality. The other flip side to that is he thinks, and by the way, if you think what we call capitalism, if you think commercial societies are unequal, go and check out the Mongol hordes of Genghis Khan. Because if you want to see inequality in human societies, that's where you find inequality. One or two people have everything and everybody else has almost nothing, and they can be pillaged, subjugated, murdered at the drop of a hat. That's inequality. So just keep it in historical perspective. So that's a big part of the story. Another part, though, is that Smith is very sensitive to what he calls the corruption of our moral sentiments. And he says that the disposition to admire and even worship the rich and powerful is the greatest cause of the corruption of our moral sentiments. Smith thinks there's something odd about human psychology, which is we tend to defer to rich people and think they somehow, just because they're rich, know better than us. They have authority. We should defer to them. We should let them have power. And as a result, we tend to let them off for all kinds of bad behavior that we wouldn't let our neighbors off. We wouldn't let our family or our friends get away with that. But for some reason, because people are rich, we give them an easy ride. We give them a free pass. And insofar as liberalized commercial societies will create more inequality and more rich people, they will create more corruption of our moral sentiments. And of course, the obvious example where you know I'm going with this is the current president of the United States leveraged the fact that he was a supposed billionaire around 2015, 2016, and he didn't shy away from it. He lent into it, and many people thought, oh yeah, why not put the businessman in charge of our politics? And since then, he's consistently been getting away with appalling behavior that even his supporters would not tolerate from their neighbors. But there's some quirk in human psychology which means that we tend to be corrupted in this way. And Smith thought that was a real problem. He was really worried about this.
So it's then the job of, let's call it political philosophy, that is, trying to get behind the surface and look at the deep forces at work to help us recognize this. Is there something we can do about it? So, for instance, if this is a quirk in our psychology, is it a remediable quirk? Would being more aware of it make us less likely to fall for it? And on the other side, I mean, there's corruption, but in a way, as you've described it, it goes both ways. So the rich are getting away with it, but the rest of us are enabling it. If we were to stop enabling it, would it require us to be more conscious of the other? It's not a quirk of human psychology, it's a fact of human psychology, that as well as admiring the rich, we do also tend to resent them, or at the very least, to envy them. do you end up getting squeezed in a way between two semi-unpalatable choices, one of which is you're too subservient to the rich, the other of which is, frankly, you're too angry about them? Is there a space in between that Smith wants us to occupy?
So interestingly, Smith is a very good and very astute analyst of envy. And what he says, and I think this is now borne out by the modern behavioral psychological research, actually, which is people get envious of their neighbors. They get envious of people who are close to them in social standing. And if you want to see this, and you'll remember from your days in academia, David, academics are so envious of other people in their departments, right? The person who got the publication or the job or the research grant that they didn't get, and they get very envious about that. But they're much more relaxed about people in, I don't know, Formula One or the salaries of Premier League football players. And Smith says envy drives us, but we're much more attuned to being envious of people who we are already at the same level of social standing are. But we're actually intensely relaxed about people who we conceive of as being outside our bracket. And so the strange thing about envy is it doesn't play in politics like we often would expect. And that Marxists, ever since Marx wrote, have sort of been waiting for the working class to rise up in envy against the rich, against the, the bourgeois elites. And often, this has been a fear of the rich, God, won't they rise up and, we mustn't give political power to the poor because they will use their political power to take our stuff away. And Smith says it doesn't work like that. Interestingly, human psychology, humans are very much driven by envy, but only towards people who are already quite close to their status. People who are sufficiently far away from them, they're remarkably relaxed about it. They tend to think, if I had all their wealth, then my life would be really nice because I could buy I could buy a Bentley and I could go on nice holidays and I could have power and influence, and that would be nice. And so instead of resenting these people for having that power and influence, we tend to think they must have a nice life. I'd be happy if I was them. And we feel quite positive towards them. So we don't end up stuck in between the rock and the hard place you've just described on Smith's account, because we're remarkably relaxed about inequality, so long as the inequality is big enough and far enough away. So why is that dangerous? Well, because you can't rely on people spontaneously regulating societies in which to keep a leash on people like Donald Trump or other people who are likely to abuse their political power to give themselves and their family more. They're weirdly likely to give these people a free ride. So Smith's answer is we've got to focus on, and this goes back to the conversation we had last week, institutions. We've got to go back to thinking about how do we create structures such that it's not possible for certain individuals to get a hold of the political matrix in order to enrich themselves and screw over everybody else. Because strangely, except in perhaps the most extreme circumstances when people are already so downtrodden that it becomes unbearable, people tend to let this happen. And yet they will actually be acting against their own interests, because this will end up just having wealth consolidated amongst the rich and the powerful, who will use that to screw over everybody else. So the emphasis for Smith ends up being we need to design our institutions in ways that control that kind of behavior.
So does it go, this is probably too directional, but does it go like this in a way, as you've just described it, that you ask the philosophical questions, the basic questions about the structure of societies and what does and doesn't seem inevitable, and it pushes you in the direction of asking questions about human psychology. Why do we tolerate some things and not other things? Why are we relaxed about this and agitated about that? And that then pushes you in the direction of history. So we go from philosophy to psychology to history. Philosophy tells us what the fundamentals are. The fundamentals seem to raise a set of psychological puzzles. The psychological puzzles suggest to us, given human beings look like they're like that actually what we have to do is design institutions that take account of the way that human beings are in the light of the background conditions. And so philosophy leads us to history. And then what does history teach us? What can history teach us, does Smith think? Smith and Hume, his fellow great philosopher of the 18th century, probably spent more of their lives doing, reading, thinking about history than they did anything else, I think it's fair to say. That was their data set, right? Their data set was the history of human societies, what works, what doesn't work, how you arrive at this set of conditions rather than that set of conditions. What did Smith draw from that lifetime of study?
So I think that that way of sequencing it is very good in terms of a summary of what Smith was doing. The only thing I would add is, and it connects to our previous conversation, that for Smith, philosophy overlaps a lot with what we would now call psychology. That a good moral philosophy isn't just going to be thinking, what are our principles of right and wrong? What are our duties? It's going to be, okay, where does this come from in the configuration of humans understanding their interactions with each other? And that's going to be what we now call psychology. And I think one advantage that Smith had was that he was operating before the hard division between the academic disciplines that we now take for granted. And so, yeah, philosophy and psychology then translates into history. What are we going to learn? Well, I think Smith wants to say, well, you need to look at the common causal factors throughout the data set that we now have about the kinds of societies that have managed to thrive and succeed longer than others, though they all tend to fail eventually, and say, okay, what is that happened here? But then you can loop back into the philosophy and the psychology. It becomes a dynamic process. You say, oh, well, this kind of society fell apart. And look, that's explainable because when you realize that humans have a predilection to worship the rich and powerful, if you let the rich and powerful have too much control, then the society fails. The trick for future societies is to realize that that's what's likely to happen because it's happened multiple times in the past. Why don't we try and not make the same mistake again? So again, it's this integration of the disciplines. Smith would say you use the history, but then you inform your understanding of the history through your more sophisticated understanding of the philosophy, which is itself in a way grounded in human psychology.
This is pre what we would call democracy in the sense of parliamentary representative democracy, but it's not pre what we still call the rule of law in the sense that the 18th century world in which he lived, and particularly Britain, England and Scotland and Wales, was seen by the rest of continental Europe as distinctively liberal, free in certain respects. Was that the key for Smith? Was the linchpin set of institutions, not what we might call democratic institutions, but institutions organized around an understanding of the rule of law?
The short answer is yes, because for Smith, the rule of law is a multifaceted thing, but perhaps most importantly, it's the idea that the state cannot simply march in and do what it likes to its own population. So whereas Genghis Khan can come along and say, right, oh, I like that horse, I like that gobbler, I like that wife of yours, I'll take him. In modern England in particular, that's what Smith was focusing on. There have emerged a set of conventions which ultimately become backed up through the legal system itself, saying, no, there are things you can and can't do to ordinary individuals. In particular, you cannot just help yourself to their property. And once you introduce that level of security for individuals, they're able to plan their lives and act in ways where they can expect stability in the long run from their governmental structures. That basically gives them what we now think of as freedom because they can plan their lives without arbitrary interference. But the really crucial innovation, Smith thinks, is that that eventually gets applied to government itself. That the rules are not only for the way that the officers of the ruler engage with ordinary people, not just how the police have to treat you when they come round or how the judge has to treat you, the ordinary private citizen in court. It's like the government itself, the king in parliament, as it would have been in his day, has to obey certain kinds of rules. There are precedents, and it emerged, he thinks, through the English tradition of the common law, an utterly unintended outcome of lazy kings in the medieval period appointing judges on private salaries to go on administrating justice in the provinces. And over time, without anybody intending it, this emerged with a large-scale system of shared legal understandings enforced by a judiciary class that was independent financially from the crown, and then said, hey, the rules apply to you, the crown, as well as to us, the judges, and to ordinary people. And nobody meant to bring this about, but Smith thinks that's the origin of the most stable, the most prosperous form of commercial society that's yet emerged amongst the human species in all of history, and it was an accident. But yes, it's this idea of the rule of law, which will in turn play a big part in the emergence of electoral democracy in the next century. But for Smith, that's the key for why the modern British commercial society, and the French have their own version of it, although it's more complicated because they have absolutist monarchy still when he's writing, and there are different versions of this in different Western nations. But yes, Smith thinks it's this bizarre innovation of the rules apply to everybody, including the rulers. That's the great innovation of modern Western commercial societies.
So that for me raises what I think is the Adam Smith problem. So this for me then becomes the really interesting puzzle because on the cliched view, Adam Smith is a champion of free markets, and part of the argument for free markets is that free markets generate unintended consequences. People, on the cliched view, intend their own narrow private benefit, but ooh, look, out of the interaction of all of these things, you get this collective benefit, which no individual has intended because they just want a better price for their goods or they want to get stuff cheaper. Everybody ends up better off. So economics is the domain of unintended consequences. But there's usually an assumption that politics is the opposite of that. Politics is where you decide what you want to do and do it, whether you're Genghis Khan or Donald Trump or anyone in between. Good guys, good women, bad women. I don't want to make this just sound like it's the men who do it, though in Smith's time it was. But politics is the domain of intentional action. Economics is the domain in which unintended consequences rule. That's the cliche, the caricature. And I think a lot of contemporary political philosophy still has underneath it a sense that we do it in the politics space because that's where we can decide this is a good outcome, and then politics allows us to achieve it. Smith seems to be saying the really important unintended consequences actually happen in politics. You called it an accident. No one intended it. Lazy kings, greedy nobles, Magna Carta. We did an episode on Magna Carta for an earlier series, and the key lesson about Magna Carta was a complete stitch-up. It wasn't a self-conscious founding document of traditional English liberties. It was selfishness versus selfishness. But out of it, you get something which no party seems to have intended. And that then poses a really interesting puzzle. How are we now meant to think about politics if the good outcomes are accidents? History has taught us that lesson. We're going to talk about another version of this next time with another thinker, Max Weber, very much focused on politics as the domain of unintended consequences. But how does Smith square that circle? If you read Smith and you think, right, I've drawn my lesson here, I've gone from philosophy plus psychology to history and discovered the most important thing is the rule of law, and it's an accident. So we want the rule of law. What do we do? Get a lazy king and greedy nobles? What do we do?
Yeah, so this is where it gets really difficult. And Smith is extremely attuned to how difficult this is, which is you can't just say, oh, well, let's not bother having politics anymore. Let's just, treat politics like a market and have all the unintended consequences for a bunch of reasons. One important one being that other people won't agree with your understanding. They will still want to do politics, and they might want to do things like, introduce tyrants or tariffs or all kinds of things. That simply exiting politics and simply saying, oh, let it all be the market is a totally hopeless lesson to draw here, because it's not possible. Politics won't go away just because you think it would be better if it did.
And just to be clear, you're not implying, and Smith wasn't implying, that the English acquired their liberties because what was happening was a market exchange. If we're talking about the medieval period, Smith wouldn't recognize this as the operation of what he understood as markets in which unintended consequences can emerge. This was some kind of, stitch up on an enormous scale, but still the consequences were unintended. So it's not just markets that have unintended beneficial outcomes, all sorts of things. History teaches us that there are all sorts of different kinds of accidents that might produce things that no one intended and in the long run turned out to be good, but they're just very, very hard to engineer because they're accidents.
Precisely. It's not a wise political strategy to go, oh, well, accidents have worked out well in the past. I propose that we just hope for some accidents. That's not a very good political strategy.
Although it's surprisingly common. Keir Starmer, for instance, seems to have adopted that as his governing philosophy.
But Smith would say, look, if you are somebody who is a high-ranking politician who has to make decisions, you're going to have to make decisions. And although you could hope for the best consequences and be perfectly aware, in fact, the best politicians will be aware that unintended consequences are just par for the course and they're going to happen, and you can't control them, but you've got to kind of act anyway. You've got to proceed as best you can, despite knowing, look, things are going to go wrong. The planes are going to hit the Twin Towers. No one saw that coming, and there's going to be unintended consequences of your responses to that. That's just politics, right? You can't cope with that by simply attempting to exit politics. So what are you faced with? Well, Smith thinks that people in high-ranking positions of politics, they need to be attuned to two things. One, they've got to genuinely want to try and improve the life of the people whose lives they're governing, right? The kinds of politicians we want are people who want to try and do the best. They may be attuned to the fact that there are unintended consequences in the offing, but nonetheless, they try and accommodate that and they try and do their best. But they've also got to be aware that reform is inherently liable to set off unintended consequences and therefore potentially backfire and therefore make things potentially much worse. So, good political leaders are in this strange situation of they're going to have to try and improve things when things need improving, but they also need to be careful and be attuned to the risk that their very improvements that they're suggesting may make everything worse and may backfire. And that, for Smith, is the difficult position that politicians find themselves in. But it gets tricky because politicians are particularly vulnerable to what he calls the spirit of system. And the spirit of system is the human predilection for having a plan, for thinking, well, I've got this clever plan that my spads and my economists and my think tanks have told me what you need to do, let's put a name on it, mistrust, is you need to have these amazing tax cuts. You need to promise all these things about spending, which the economists will tell you don't add up. But who cares? This is our plan. There'll be a bit of pain, but then we'll move to Singapore on Thames and everything will be better. And mistrust thinks, what a great plan. That's a really good way to improve the economy and do all the things I've been saying I'll do. And I've got Kwasi Kwarteng, my faithful chancellor, to help me, and he agrees with me. This plan will be excellent. And so politicians attempted to implement the plan. The problem is that Smith says, if your plan doesn't take account for the fact that other people also have plans and they may not like your plan and they may not stick to it, that's not a very good plan. The problem is that humans like plans and they like to think that the world is like a chessboard. This is Smith's famous analogy. He says, look, if the pieces on the chessboard agree with your plan and do the same things, then it'll all work out nicely. But if the pieces on the chessboard think, no, I have my own principle of motion, I'm not doing what you say, I work in the bond markets and I'm now selling British gilts, then the plan will go horribly and the game will be miserable and things will fall apart. And the danger for politicians is they like the idea of being able to go in with a plan to reform everything for the better, but the world is complicated and full of chess pieces that don't agree with your plan, and instead of staying where you've put them, they start moving around and doing different things. And that can lead to absolute chaos and misery. And the really important thing here from a modern perspective is, on Smith's account, this is not confined to either the left or the right. Historically, we've tended to associate the idea of plans that backfire horribly with the political left, because in the 20th century, things like Stalin's 5-year plans, you might get a large increase in tank production, but you get an awful lot of human misery, and you also get a lot of kulaks being starved in Ukraine and all the other things that were an offshoot of politicians imposing rigid plans and responding to the pieces not doing what they're told by, for example, killing them. And that's the most extreme version of when the spirit of system goes wrong. But Smith is very attuned to the fact, or Smithians today can be very attuned to the fact that it can happen on the right as well. If you could say, right, well, the plan is to deindustrialize the North and get Britain off coal because coal is inefficient, and that's what we're doing tomorrow, and the miners should just accept that they're being fired and go on the dole, or they should all move to London and get jobs in the city. Well, what you actually get is an enormous amount of social disharmony and unhappiness. And that, again, the Thatcherite imposition of monetary reforms in the 80s was very much a instantiation of the spirit of system, nowhere near as dramatic as a Stalinist 5-year plan. But fast forward to recently, Liz Truss saying, I've got a fantastic plan, I'm just going to impose that on society. Well, that didn't work. And Smith would have said, what did you expect? Liz Truss, spirit of system, very, very, very manifest.
And one of the really deep ironies here is it wasn't just Liz Truss, it wasn't just Kwasi Kwarteng, it was the Adam Smith Institute that was championing that particular system. And in that equalization of the blame on left and right, the traditional response of the people whose plan hasn't worked out is always, they didn't give us enough time. Liz Truss has a podcast which might as well be called They Didn't Give Me Enough Time. In her case, it's true, she only had 47 days, but the longer it went on, the worse it would have got. It still raises for me this puzzle, which is, in a way, I guess, between philosophy, psychology, and history. The history and the philosophy both push us back to psychology, which is how we meant to orient ourselves in a world in which so much is inadvertent. The good things are often a consequence of historical contingency. So one of the problems here is that the rest of the world in the 18th century might have looked at England or England and Scotland and said, we want a bit of that. The problem is they're not England. They're not Scotland. their 13th century, 14th century was very different. It didn't generate a common law tradition. It didn't generate a set of historic liberties. Can you just impose those? Well, no, because the lesson of history is that these things are not imposed. They are inadvertent outcomes. And it feels a bit like what Smith is saying. You can tell me if this is wrong, but everyone will know the famous Serenity Prayer, which is underpinning, among other things, 12-step programs. The Serenity Prayer says, "Grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference." Now, on the one hand, that's almost become a trite cliche. On the other hand, that sounds to me like what Smith thought was the absolutely fundamental set of questions. If the challenge of philosophy is to ask the right questions, you're not going to get anywhere unless you ask the right questions of the right things. And for Smith, we had to ask all of those questions. So you can't just ask the question, what I want to change for the better. You can't also just ask the conservative question, which is, why is change bad? Because we can't change things. You have to know the difference between the two, but you will only know the difference between the two if you ask the question, what can we change and what can't we change? And yet I'm a bit nervous of this because it is a bit trite. And also, for some people, actually, it's quite small c conservative. It gives too much ground to the things that we can't change. Is Smith the Serenity Prayer?
So it's an interesting question because I think he may well be when it comes to doing political philosophy and how he thinks we should do it. But in a way, it doesn't really matter when it comes to political philosophy because the stakes are so small. Ultimately, I think Smith would agree with this. People like you and me talking about it on a podcast, or people like me publishing articles in journals that three people read. Well, I think that we should follow the Serenity Prayer. But if we don't, it doesn't really matter. The kind of more interesting question is, well, should the Serenity Prayer be applied to politicians? And I think Smith would say, absolutely. You absolutely want politicians, not in a sort of personal growth sense, but in a, Keir Starmer would probably do well to apply that to himself, not as Keir Starmer, the private individual, but as Prime Minister. All politicians would. The problem is, when they get it wrong, the stakes can be dramatically high and ordinary people can suffer tremendously. And then it would be really nice, I think, if we, the political philosophers, could say, hey, we've worked out the Serenity Prayer. Here you go, Mr. Politician. Here's how you should do it. But unfortunately, Smith, I think, is very skeptical of the chances of politicians reading political philosophers who've applied the Serenity Prayer to their own political philosophy and therefore translating that into their own actions. And we are definitely going to come back to this theme next time when we talk about Weber, because this leads directly into Weber. But Smith, I think, would not have been under any illusions that if he gets it right in the 6th edition of the Theory of Moral Sentiments, then the politicians in Westminster are going to pick it up and they're all going to become better at applying the Serenity Prayer to politics. I don't think he thought that, and he wouldn't have been at all surprised to learn that I think Charles James Fox, the leader of the Whigs, stands up in Parliament and waves a copy of The Wealth of Nations, and Adam Smith has taught us. And then a few years later, he kind of confessed he never read it. Of course he hadn't. And of course, the great irony of Smith's work, who's telling us, you've got to be careful, you've got to think really hard about the complex historical interface, the way there's unintended consequences will just spool out of everything. Then his name gets taken up by people who want to empower the spirit of system and ignore the Serenity Prayer, and they use his name as the authority to do that. And it's one of the unintended ironic consequences of history, which I suppose is quite fitting, although in that case, I'm sure Adam Smith would have wished it hadn't gone that way.
Given that it is, as you say, extremely unlikely that politicians are going to spend their time doing or reading or worrying about political philosophy as a self-contained discipline, and therefore, one of the ironies of the world in which we live is that political philosophy for the last 50 plus years has been very focused on a way of thinking about justice. And though it's had a lot of impact on how lawyers and judges in the United States particularly interpret the cases that come before them, judges and lawyers have plenty of time to think about it, not least because if they go to law school, it's often one of the courses that they take is a course in political philosophy. But politicians, there's very little evidence, apart from Martin Sheen, Jed Bartlett on the West Wing, and by the way, he's not real, spend their time thinking about political philosophy in the language of justice that has come to dominate it as a discipline. So there seems to be a disconnect between politics and political philosophy in Smith's time, in our time. I would say on the whole that you can't be a politician without being pretty attuned to human psychology. It may not be as an academic discipline, it may just be instinctive, but successful politicians are almost certainly going to have to be smart psychologists. Seems to me the interesting one is history. That actually what Smith is implying is that it would be better if politicians had at least some more understanding of history, not spend their days reading the kind of history that he and David Hume read, but maybe getting some of it from the writing that they produced on the back of that history, but just generally more of a sense of historical contingency, because no question, one of the kinks in human psychology is that we prioritize the present. We have a kind of presentist bias. We all do, but politicians as well. We have a feeling that this time is different. We have a feeling that the new thing also has some intellectual merit simply because it is new, because we came up with it. And history is a great way, including, I have to say, the history of ideas, which is partly what Smith was thinking about. Where did these ideas come from? Where did the idea of the rule of law come from? It's a historical contingency. Maybe the thing that political philosophy teaches us is that politicians should not be more philosophical, they should be more historical.
I mean, I personally think that's correct. I also think Smith would have agreed, and I think I get it because I've read a lot of Smith. But what's really interesting here is how bad politicians are at having a historical mindset. And there's a few examples here. One leading candidate for major politician of our lifetimes who had no historical sense whatsoever and really could have done with one, Tony Blair. We all know that, right? And in general, the Iraq War. It's just astonishing to think that politicians could think, oh, it's different this time, and we'll turn that part of the world into a democracy overnight, and that'll work out fine.
Not least because they were framing it in the abstract language of justice and the rule of law and democracy as abstractions, not as historical products.
But one thing that really struck me about that, I was on holiday in Vietnam 10 years ago now, and I went to the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. It used to be Saigon. It's a very, very interesting museum if anyone ever finds themselves out there, because they're much less one-sided than you might expect, given it's a communist regime. But I did the maths and I thought, okay, so the US pulls out in, 75, 76, and then Iraq is 2003. It's less than 30 years. How could less than 30 years go by and Americans have forgotten what a disaster it was last time and think, oh, let's just do something like that again? Of course, they thought this time it's different. And then a friend of mine pointed out, well, you've got to remember that some of the people, around Rumsfeld and Cheney were psychologically scarred by the fact that they were junior people when the US had to pull out. And they were influenced by, okay, that's interesting. But then I saw a quote on Substack the other day, which I'll steal and pretend it was my own insight, which is the most important lesson of history is that human beings do not learn the lessons of history. And I think that captures it brilliantly, which is that we are very, very bad at thinking, hang on a minute, we've tried this before and it didn't work. Maybe we shouldn't do that. And it does seem to be a recurring feature of the political class. Extremely good at psychology intuitively, not as academics, but you have to be able to read other people, and yet completely not tuned into historical precedent, not even historical precedent, the lessons of history. And I think Smith would have said, yeah, that one thing they could really do with this is a greater historical sensibility. A recurring feature of our politics, it seems, is that people who are successful in politics often don't have that. And it's one thing that we'd all be better off if they did have. Maybe they should all listen to this podcast, David. I don't know.
We may or may not cut that out at the end. Next time, a conversation about a thinker from the late 19th, early 20th century, whose ideas often put him at odds with the preoccupations of political philosophy today. But that does not mean that his thought was not deeply engaged with the biggest questions of politics. We're going to be talking about how Max Weber can help us make sense of what's going on. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.